Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin. We have Jonathan over here. And before we get into the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to the people of LA. We've had multiple devastating fires that have caused tens of billions of dollars worth of damage. I know people who have lost absolutely everything. And Jonathan, I think
as well.
it's the same for you. Yeah. So, you know what? Like, it's these disasters, there's just no words. And, we're just really sorry it happened. And, we're thinking about them.
Yep. And just, I mean, you're in LA right now, so this is very real to you right now. And it's unfortunately the kind of thing that's all over the country. A couple of years ago, right down the street from me, there was a massive fire in Louisville and Boulder County. We were on the get ready to evacuate list. We could see the smoke and see glowing from flames. And these are horrible situations, and we ended up being all right. So just like you said, our thoughts are with people in LA. We're thinking about you. So I guess beyond that, right, one thing that happened today, I just want to mention briefly, is Trump got sentenced, and he was sentenced to nothing, right? So that's basically over. There was a lot of sound and fury about that, but it's done. And he got no punishment, but he is now officially a sentenced felon. So I guess we can take note of that in whatever way it is.
It is truly shocking that he has not been punished. Wow.
Yeah, shocking.
But I do want to mention that the Jack Smith report should be out next week. And so we'll be covering that part. It's not Trump has been involved in many legal cases. So this was just a New York case, but we'll be talking about the federal cases in much more detail next week.
Definitely going to revisit that. In terms of other stuff in the news that we thought was important, we're going to talk a bit about what's going on with Meta. Meta, there's a lot of talk about it that, Meta is going MAGA, and Meta, at the very least, is kowtowing to MAGA. They're doing everything they can to make Donald Trump happy so Zuckerberg can continue to profit in very large ways from his metaverse. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to switch gears in another court case, sticking with social media, but talking about TikTok stuff. I know that's particularly interesting to you, and you've been sort of the self-assigned person to follow all the latest developments with that.
Right. So this morning, TikTok argued in front of the Supreme Court. I very rarely listen to oral arguments, but I did for this show. So we're going to be talking about not only the political ramifications of a possible ban, but we're going to talk about, the legal issues involved, right? And I just want to be clear that there's a difference between the legal aspects and the political aspects.
And then last but not least in our introduction, I have back to having an actual beer this week. I'm over my cold. Good news for those of us in Colorado. Allagash is now shipping beers to Colorado. Allagash is a really good brewery from Maine. It's known for having some of the best Belgian-style beers in the country. This is a Belgian white, Allagash white. Shouldn't surprise you. Really solid beer. I've had it at the Great American Beer Festival before, but now I can actually buy it in Colorado. As you can see, it's sort of an unfiltered wheat beer. It's got those sort of bubble gummy kind of flavors, banana, clove stuff, a little bit of citrus because it's brewed with orange peel, and it's got some coriander in it as well. It's just a really solid Belgian-style ale, and it's nice to have another option for that kind of stuff in Colorado. Okay, so as we said, we're going to start here by talking about what's going on at Meta. And in case any of you are living under a rock, Meta is what Facebook changed the name of their company to a few years ago, when they wanted to be known as stuff beyond Facebook, so incorporating WhatsApp and Instagram and all that good stuff. But in any case, the big news this week is that Zuckerberg announced that they're going to stop fact-checking on Facebook. And along with that, there's now going to be some sort of permissible level of hate speech, especially around LGBTQ rights and trans stuff and anything involving religion. You're allowed to criticize people for being mentally ill or weird if it's supported by your religion. For some reason, I guess that's acceptable discrimination. In any case, there's a big change, right? Way back after scandals they had in the late 2016, 2017, Facebook said, hey, we better do some fact checking. People want fact checking. We're going to have it. And now, with his reading of the political winds, Zuckerberg seems to think, you know what? At least the people in charge don't want fact checking. So let's get rid of that. And if you think about why they're after it, right? Basically, we want to talk about what they're doing, why they're doing it, what are some of the ramifications. The why seems pretty straightforward to me, and they basically kind of come out and said, well, yeah, pretty much, they want to make Donald Trump happy, right? Zuckerberg is suggesting, oh, you know what? There's this new public attitudes towards free speech, and we're going to respond to that. It's really not that. It's going to make Donald Trump happy, right? And they've done all kinds of things to try to make Donald Trump happy. They've donated to his inaugural fund. They put Joel Kaplan, who is a prominent Republican, is their new global affairs lead. They put Dana White on their board. And if you don't know who Dana White is, congratulations. Unfortunately, I'm not so lucky. He's in charge of all the MMA fighting you see on ESPN. He makes a killing for it, and he's one of Trump's friends. Trump loves him. And basically his qualification is he's a Trump friend, right? So the Facebook people, the Meta people, Zuckerberg in particular, going out of their way to show, hey, you know what? We're friendly to Republicans. They're even moving content moderation to Texas from California to avoid the appearance of bias. Not sure how that works, right? If you think California is too biased for conservatives, why you think Texas isn't too biased for liberals to be happy with it is kind of beyond me, but it sort of speaks to the major point here, which is we're going to make Donald Trump happy because we have some stake in, one, not being regulated, and two, getting government contracts and continuing to make a lot of money, right?
Right. And I think one thing that was interesting was when a reporter asked Trump, hey, Facebook has this new policy. Why do you think this happened? Do you think it was due to the threats you're making? And Trump said, yeah, probably.
Probably, yes.
And I'm like, wow, that
kind of out loud a lot. That's one
thing.
Yeah,
that gives the game away, right? I don't know if this is like necessarily nefarious, right? As you said, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg and the rest of the board at Facebook is like, yeah, you know what? We believe in MAGA ideology. We're going to just push everything, right? I think this is just you know what? We're business. We're here to make money. We're going to put our heads down, and we just don't want to be in the news. As you mentioned before, with this whole Cambridge Analytica scandal, with user data, this aspect of Russia leveraging social media companies to interfere in our elections, there's a lot of heat towards social media, especially Facebook, because I think Facebook was probably the most egregious of them all. And so Facebook responded to that.
How times have changed, right?
Right. and so Facebook, responded to that. They came up with this fact-checking program where they had ostensibly like really good journalists partnered with them, and they would do their best to combat misinformation. And then in 2020, that election, we had COVID and a lot of misinformation spread there. And so they had to like really bring the hammer down. And I think when you have, content moderation policies that bring the hammer down, you're inevitably going to censor some people who shouldn't have been censored, right? And so that caused a lot of backlash among conservatives in particular. And now I think, Facebook is just like, whoa. Like, we just want to be out of the news again. We're going to appease MAGA. And you know what? Come 2028, if the Democrats are in power or if there's like another scandal, I have to imagine that Facebook is just going to be like, oh, yeah, well, yeah, we didn't take that into consideration. We're going to do better next time, right? This is just what you should expect from a corporate entity that is here to make money and not much else, right? There's so much evidence about social media harming the health of our children. They know it, right? There are people who have blown the whistle when it comes to how addictive these algorithms are, how teen mental health has been plummeting. And you know what? They're just, they're not doing much, right?
And I think you're right that in some respects, this is the kind of behavior that you would expect from a business trying to stay under the radar. But I think that they've kind of really gone as far as they can. They're really pushing it and really making a bet that the money to be made is through appeasing conservatives and that liberals won't get angry enough to cost them money, which is an interesting bet. A lot of times that their lobbying money will deter liberal politicians from actually doing anything. It has in the past. no regulation of any substances come down the pike about any sort of social media. But it will be interesting to see kind of what happens. It does bring us to the question of, well, why do we care? What's really going to happen? Is it going to matter that that Meta is trying to make Donald Trump happy? And I would say in a number of ways, it probably will, right? Is if you think about, why does Donald Trump and MAGA, why do they hate fact checking so much? It's not because liberals lie and it's effective for liberals. It's because they lie, their influencer types lie, and their base believes it, right? Lying is effective for them, and they have no qualms about using it, and they want to be able to continue to use it, right? It's not that they think, oh, you know what, we need to make sure that liars are given free reign. They don't believe they're lying. They just think that fact checkers are making political judgments against the lies and not allowing it. And so if they're against fact checking, it's not for First Amendment reasons. It's because the fact checking gets in the way of what they're trying to do. And I think that making that easier for them isn't going to help, can't help anything. That's sort of my stance on fact checking. It's like, even if the fact checking itself wasn't effective, and the new community notes, even if they are as effective or even a little bit more, right, than the old fact checking, just the propaganda win of Facebook saying, you know what, we're not going to do fact checking anymore. We're going to let the conservatives who are complaining about it say whatever they want. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to you can argue against it, but we're not going to be in the business of fact checking. We think we've gone too far. It is a huge win for MAGA and all the MAGA adherents that Facebook is getting out of the way and letting them say whatever they want.
Yeah, I think you're right about the propaganda win aspect of things. When it comes to the actual spread of misinformation, disinformation, and frankly, just like the health of how we talk to each other, I'm not convinced that this is going to make much of a dent. You know, with fact checking, it's interesting, right? Because oftentimes the lie travels around the world, 10 times before
or the truth wakes up. Yes, the old
exactly. Cliche. And so I just don't know how effective fact checking was with Facebook. With Twitter, they use community notes. And for those of you who don't know what community notes are, basically it was like crowdsourcing truth. And so, you would see a tweet and you'd be like, that seems really wrong. And so you would flag it. It would go to the community note system, and then the truth would be crowdsourced. And it's, somewhat effective in the sense that a community note tends to be truthful. But even with community notes, the spread of the mis or disinformation still occurred. Now, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that, hey, most people aren't going to share a tweet that has been labeled as this is not truthful, but you're still not going to solve the genesis problem, right? Where you have someone who's nefarious, who knows what they're saying is wrong, or someone who's just a lunatic and stupid and saying something that's wrong, right? You're never going to fix that unless you absolutely throttle the spread of all information. And I just don't see that happening with social media, right? And so whether or not they use fact checking or community notes, to me, I think the bigger issue is that we just have media illiteracy in this country, right? And that's a long-term problem that's going to take a lot of effort to solve.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that, Twitter has community notes, right? Twitter has become basically a right-wing cesspool, for lack of a better term, for a lot of users, simply because the person in charge is more than happy to spread misinformation. He's been community noted, as we discussed before we got online here, and doesn't stop the spread of his stuff. And I think in some respects, like for some people, a community note will be kind of like a badge of honor. It's like, of course the liberals think this is wrong. Of course this people, so whether or not it's effective, if you're believing the stuff you read on social media, you're already kind of fallen down the rabbit hole. You really have.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, something like half of American citizens or population or whatever gets their news, at least in part, from social media, right? People aren't reading newspapers. People aren't reading magazines and journals and stuff. People are getting their news on social media. So it's not going to get any better.
Right.
It's just, it sends a troubling sign. As I said before, I think it's this propaganda thing is not good. Also, I don't like that they're loosening the reins on hate speech. Again, we can debate what's hate speech and what isn't, if this is really hate speech, if it's not, but they weren't allowing certain discrimination before, and now they are. And people are going to take advantage of that. We all know this. We're going to have, if they allow this discrimination, some people will do it just for trolling purposes. Some people will do it because it's allowed. Some people will do it because they feel strongly about it. But in any case, the people subject to these kind of attacks are going to be subject to more of them now. And Facebook is going to be like, meh. You know what? The community will have to respond. I mean, it's a good way of washing your hands of any kind of responsibility, which really is kind of what Zuckerberg's been after all along. He wants to say, oh, it's not me, it's them. And he's kind of doing that now because I think with Trump in charge, it's very unlikely that he'll be held responsible.
Right. And I think this kind of gets down to like, what does it mean to have free speech, right? On one hand, there's free speech that the government shouldn't be able to penalize you for saying stuff. That's one interpretation of free speech. And then there's the essence of free speech, where it's, do you support the free flow of ideas, right? And then I think when it comes to hate speech, that's where it gets tricky, because there are some things that should just not be said. I guess a good example is like, if you say something at work and it gets you fired, well, should that get you censored on something like Facebook, right? That's an interesting debate to have. Obviously, like if you're saying the N-word all the time, yeah, Facebook should just say, yeah, we're going to get rid of that. We're going to ban you. Most forums, if you go to like a gaming forum or like an automotive forum or something like that, they're going to have some sort of content moderation, right? You can't post pornography. You can't just say racist shit all the time. And you know what? Like, where do you draw the line? And I think in the 2019 to 2021 era, we did get a little too touchy, right? You might say something in jest and people would interpret that really wrongly and you would get banned for it. And it's just like, whoa, I was just making a joke here. Like, I'm actually supporting this cause, right? And I'm not saying that this is what's happening with Facebook now, but I do think that we did moderate content a bit too much.
No, I mean, that's a possible interpretation of it. The one problem that I have with that sort of whole line of reasoning is that this is a private company. There is no free speech rights inherent in a private company. They can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right? If you don't like it, leave. You have no rights to using Facebook. You have no rights to self-expression on Facebook. Facebook is a private company. Just like you said, if you say something at work, you can be fired for stuff you say at work. Whereas if you said it on a public street, you could not be arrested for it, right? So again, to me, it kind of gets back to Zuckerberg all along has been like, oh, I'm not responsible for what people say. And he doesn't want to be in the business of regulating anything, right? Really, I think if it came down to it, he'd like to just say, I'm turning on Facebook, people do what they want.
Right.
If he was being honest with us, he would say that's what he wants. That's how he would like Facebook to be, right? I think he thinks he can get away with more of that now when saying, oh, you know what, we're just going to do it because the Republicans are probably going to be okay with that, right? But if you think about the discrimination that you're allowing by allowing people to post whenever they want, gays are insane, right? Mm-hmm. If you're transgender, you're a lunatic. And for most, I'm guessing, fairly well-adjusted adults who happen to be gay or transgender, it doesn't mean anything. They don't care, right? But if you're, say, you can be 13 on Facebook, I believe.
I don't know what the age limit is. Should be 18, right?
But it's not. There's a lot of teenagers on Facebook. If you're struggling with your sexual identity or whatever, and you're now getting bullied on Facebook, in addition to whatever you're going through in real life, it can't help.
No.
Right? That's a legitimate negative consequence that you're now suffering because Zuckerberg thinks it'll make Trump happy. And I'd like to think he might reconsider this kind of thing, but he won't until he gets in trouble for it, like you say. If people start complaining that, hey, people are killing themselves over this abuse they're suffering on Facebook, then Zuckerberg might reconsider. Until then, if it makes the Trump administration happy and keeps them from investigating Facebook, Zuckerberg will be happy. And I think that that's really a shame. I don't think we should subject people to additional forms of discrimination that they didn't have to suffer before.
Yeah. I mean, I think what it boils down to is money, right? Twitter saw a mass exodus of ad revenue once the cesspool started. And for some reason, Musk hasn't really done much. Maybe he's anticipating that the ads will come back. But
we'll get into this when we talk more about TikTok and what the Chinese government is like. But in that respect, I think Elon Musk is kind of like the Chinese government. He doesn't care.
Right.
He really doesn't care how much money Facebook costs or loses. Yeah. It's like it's his tool. He's doing what he wants to with.
Whereas I do think Facebook is
Zuckerberg
more
cares
sensitive to that.
Yes. Zuckerberg's not an ideologue. He's not trying to push a certain view in the way Musk is. So if Facebook tanks, Zuckerberg can't say, well, I'll go back to my Tesla company. Oh, wait a minute. I don't have a Tesla company, right? This is what I've got.
Right. So I do think that, people have power, right? You can vote with your wallet here. There are alternatives to Facebook.
We're going to have to start looking into Blue Sky.
Right. There are alternatives to Instagram, WhatsApp, less so.
I think you're right in terms of, when and if it affects Zuckerberg's bottom line, then he'll make some sort of change. Because this did not come about because he woke up one day and said, you know what? We're not doing enough for free speech. We need to do more for free. That's not what happened here. It'll be better for our bottom line if we do this. And until that calculation changes, this is what you're going to get. All right. So now that we've talked about the Meta stuff, why don't you guide us into the TikTok stuff, Justin, since you've been following that so closely?
Right. So first of all, what is TikTok? It is a social media app that generates short form content. All the young people are using it, and I am too old to use it now. So there you go. There are over 100 million users in America, and so the reach is just incredible. Now, TikTok is interesting because it's an American company that is a subsidiary of ByteDance, which is a foreign company owned by China. And in case you've been living under a rock, America and China have always been butting heads.
Well, maybe not always, but for quite a while.
Yeah, at least in my lifetime. So last year, there was a deal reached where we had Ukraine aid and aid to Israel, military aid. And that was coupled with this bill that would effectively ban TikTok if they did not meet certain requirements. So this bill is called the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. For the rest of this segment, I'm just going to call it the bill.
Actually, we could call it the law now.
Yeah,
the law. That's the whole point.
Yeah,
right?
We'll call it the law.
Yes.
So this law basically says, hey, if you are controlled by a foreign adversary, you cannot distribute or update or maintain these applications.
More or less, I mean, just to kind of sum it up, ByteDance has to sell TikTok because we're not going to let TikTok continue to function if it's owned by the Chinese.
Right. That's what it boils down to.
Yes.
And, obviously that has a lot of legal implications, and we're going to get into that. But one thing I do want to point out, though, is if you look up stuff about the Uyghurs, which is a group that's being discriminated against in China, or any other
Tiananmen
Square, the Hong Kong protests, shockingly, you don't see that much content on TikTok, whereas on Instagram you do. And so there's an NCRI study that we linked in the show notes that you can look at, and it talks about how there is a substantial difference in content. Additional companies could be added, right? So if you have over 1 million monthly active users and you allow users to share content with each other, and if you're owned by China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran, and the president says you're a national security threat, you can be added to this list. So ByteDance and TikTok were in this list, right? They are part of the law. They're explicitly named.
Well, what this is more or less a reason looking for a law, right? They decided we want to ban TikTok. How do we do it? This is how. And they're pretending that it applies to any company that does this, but it's really, we want to ban TikTok if the Chinese don't sell it.
Right. So again, I mentioned like the legal versus political ramifications. So I want to talk about the political ramifications first. So young people are just livid, right? This is their primary form of entertainment, and oftentimes it's a way to get information. And a lot of progressives are pointing out that, hey, this bill only passed because young people are really interested in the Palestinian perspective regarding the war in Gaza. And this is just the military-industrial complex, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, all these other anti-progressive causes. This is just payback, right?
Well, I have to say that I haven't read all that much about this because I don't follow the Gen Z trends, but I hope it's not a lot of them. I hope it's just some, because this is very convenient where everybody who has a grief says, you know what? The Jews are behind it. And it just strikes me as just, congratulations, you've fallen down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole as well. Something's going wrong with you if this is where you think this problem is coming from. Because people have been talking about banning TikTok for a long time. And as you pointed out, China and the United States kind of at odds in a lot of different ways.
Right. So Trump, during his first presidency, so that was 2016 through 2020, they tried to get TikTok banned through executive order. And so this law is a response to, all right, well, we're going to get Congress involved. And we've been begging Congress to do stuff for ages, right? We've always been saying, Congress, do your job. Well, they did their job. And President Biden signed the bill into law. So now we just have the final arbiter, the Supreme Court. They're going to determine if this law is constitutional or not. And I do want to add this caveat that, just because something is constitutional doesn't mean it's a good idea, right?
Oh, yeah, we've had plenty of laws that are constitutional are not a very good idea. Like the Fugitive Slave Act, for example.
Yeah. So on one hand, I don't want people to get too hung up on, the legalese. I mean, it matters because there's going to be precedent set and all that. We're going to talk about some of these scrutiny levels and, all that good stuff. But the time to be upset was back then, right? Now, you can lobby Congress again to change the law, but again, you had your chance. You've wasted a lot of political capital by not doing something.
And honestly, one of the few things I have been reading about TikTok is that a lot of the TikTok influencers are already sort of hedging their bets. People are migrating to Instagram and YouTube, and from what I've read, it sounds like they're fairly insulated. There won't be much of an impact on the people that are making their money through being influencers on TikTok. Again, users might be another story. You're going to have to find your content somewhere else. But still, it seems like the world of TikTok is adapting to, well, what's going to happen if the Chinese don't sell?
Right. And so what were the things that the U.S. government was upset about? So there are two things. One, it's the data harvesting. So anytime you use TikTok or any social media application, your data is being harvested, it's being packaged, it's being sold, it's being analyzed, and they use the data to train the algorithms to give you more content to increase engagement, right? That's nothing new. I think what's different here, though, is that it's the Chinese government that has your data. And so what the government has argued is, hey, we have young people who are using this application right now. They might be looking at things that they shouldn't be looking at, but hey, they think it's private. But then say you want to become an FBI agent 10 years from now. What happens if you want to be a member of the State Department? There are a whole bunch of national security implications there, and you could be subject to blackmail. And I don't think it's feasible for the FBI to say, hey, have you ever used a social media application before in their background checks? That's just not feasible, right?
Well, the answer to that is yes, right? So
Right,
it's a stupid question. But
right.
I mean, I think there's more than the hypothetical though. I was watching CNN as I was eating lunch today, right? And they had this woman on. I can't remember who she was, but she was a reporter. She was doing some stories on TikTok, and she was having a negative view of TikTok, right? Because if you dig into some of the things they do, it's not the greatest stuff. But as it turned out, they were tracking her movements through TikTok, at the company, and they said, "Oh, we're sorry, we fired people that were doing this, and they shouldn't do this, and this is not proper." But guess what? You don't get caught the first time. That's not the first time they're going to do this. People knew how to do it. This is a thing. That this ByteDance is as a Chinese company, right? The Chinese government has full access to everything involved with every single Chinese company. And if they're not doing it right now, it's only because they don't feel like doing it. They will do it if and when they want to. So to pretend that data is segregated and that the Chinese Communist Party does not have access to it is just a fallacy.
Right. And that's what they tried to do before, right? They say, hey, well, all the data is on Oracle servers and there's built-in firewalls and all that. But the reality is, for the algorithm to work, they need the data. And so the second national security aspect is the idea that we don't understand how the algorithm works. And I think that is slightly different than understanding how, say, the YouTube algorithm works or the Facebook algorithms, because there are programs set up with the government that at least allow for some level of understanding, right? You don't need to know the nitty gritty details about how the algorithm works, but through the national security channels, there are agreements with the major companies, but they don't have that with TikTok. They can't, because the Chinese government says this algorithm is important to our national security interests. And so you can't know about it, right? And so the US is responding by saying, well, technically you can manipulate the data and you could foment rebellion and all these other things, right? It's a possibility. Now, I do think that the government is kind of overplaying its hand here in that regard, but I do find it a legitimate national security.
Yeah, I think it's legitimate to say it could be used for Chinese propaganda,
Right.
And as you said, it's hard to find stuff on there about Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs. It's hard to find stuff on there about Chinese crackdown in Hong Kong. It's hard to find stuff on there about Tiananmen Square. That, in some regards, is Chinese propaganda, right? And if we are worried, as we talked about with Meta and Facebook, about manipulation of elections, certainly the Chinese Communist Party is not above that. Just last week, they hacked into the government, right? They are adversarial with us, right? Mm-hmm. And to give them free access to 100 million Americans to show them whatever they feel like, you can see that that's not going to be in the interest of our country, right?
Right.
And I think we talked about this before. What's interesting is this is only an issue because it's owned by China, right? It's a Chinese company. If this was an American company doing this, the government would have no leg to stand on, right? It's protected free speech in the United States. You're an American actor, you can do whatever you want, right? It's because it's a Chinese actor, that's where there's the problem.
Right. So I think that allows us to move on to what happened at the circuit court, right? So the circuit court, they wrote the opinion, and because of their ruling, they basically said this ban can be upheld, and it was argued at the Supreme Court today through appeal. And the government, they're going to argue that, hey, there are no First Amendment implications, and we just need to use this one test. And I think you and I can both agree that no. Like, obviously, there are going to be First Amendment implications here. And the circuit court agreed that, yeah, there are First Amendment implications. You're crazy. But this law is narrowly tailored. It is serving national security interests, and we're going to analyze it not only through intermediate scrutiny, which is linked in the show notes, but strict scrutiny, which is a higher standard. They upheld that the law doesn't infringe upon the First Amendment rights of the content creators. And I think you gave a good example through the hedging of bets, right? It's just like, well, they can move on to another platform, right?
Yep.
They did reject the argument, as I said before, that TikTok doesn't have First Amendment rights because they are an American company. They have First Amendment rights. They said that, well, according to the NetEase decision, content moderation is an expression of speech. And so content curation, which is what the TikTok algorithm does, is also part of free speech, right? So that's an important aspect from a legal point of view.
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting here when you think about it is, the free speech argument versus the national security argument, right? That's basically what the court's trying to decide. Does the national security outweigh the free speech? Okay. And there's an easy way around this for TikTok, right? In that, hey, you know what? China should sell this and to an American company that's not, or any other company that's not tied with China, right? But they don't want to do that, right? And as we discussed too, that there's hundreds of billions of dollars that would be free profit for them if they do this. But the Chinese government is not concerned about that, right? That should kind of clue us in that there's something here other than free speech aspects of what's going on with the Chinese complaints. They want to have this tool. They want to be able to have American data. They want to be able to have access to American consumers, right? For whatever reason they want, just in case they need to use it, right? If they were only interested in making money, then they would be happy to sell it, take the profits, and move on to something else.
Right.
And then this entire thing would go away. That to me is another reason why it's not a free speech issue so much, in that they're not saying, hey, you can't do this. You can't have this algorithm. You can't have TikTok. It can't be controlled by the Chinese government, right? And that to me makes it a pretty easy case. And from what I've read of the way the Supreme Court reacted on asking questions today, it seems like they're headed down that path too. It's like, you know what? There are free speech issues, but they're free speech issues only because there's a national security issue involved.
Right. So, from my perspective, the national security concerns are completely legitimate. I do want to point out that there's 3 levels of evidence. There's, the evidence that we can see in the briefs. There's evidence that only TikTok and the government can see, for business related reasons. But then there's a third classification where it was classified data that the government has access to, the Supreme Court has access to, but TikTok and ByteDance did not have access to. And both courts were pretty much like, yeah, that's not fair regarding the classified material. So they all made their rulings based off the non-classified material. But I do think that the fact that they have classified material and the fact that the Solicitor General today said, by the way, Donald Trump should read his classified briefings on the matter should be a pretty good indicator. Yeah, there are some legit national security concerns. So, let's talk about the balancing with free speech. So I did mention that there's intermediate scrutiny and strict scrutiny, right? And so all that means is that with intermediate scrutiny is that the government must prove that this law is advancing an important government interest, which it is. And the method to do so in the law helps achieve that goal. And I think a ban does that, right? China is no longer involved with data acquisition and content manipulation. Great. So it passes intermediate scrutiny, basically, according to the circuit court. And then with strict scrutiny, that's a bit tougher, as by definition, right? And basically, the law has to be narrowly tailored, and it has to use the least restrictive means in order to accomplish this compelling government interest. And when it comes to national security, it's almost always a compelling government interest. The courts are never going to question the president and Congress when it comes to a national security issue like that. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Generally the courts are very deferential in terms of national security, especially when the Congress and the presidency are aligned.
Right. And that's what's so important, right? Like, very rarely do we have like this bipartisan agreement. And so I think the law would have to be particularly egregious in its implementation for the court to just be like, yeah, we're going to just ignore both sides of government here.
Yeah, and I think one thing to note too, that you say it's bipartisan deal, and largely it is, except now Donald Trump is opposed, right? A donor got his ear and told him that you shouldn't do this, and he thinks, oh, because I'm going to be president, you should put a stay on it until I'm president. Unfortunately, the court seems to have dismissed this as the ridiculous notion that it is. The calendar doesn't stop because you're going to be president, and you don't get any additional benefits because you're going to be president. Right? It shouldn't. Unfortunately, in this case, doesn't look like it's going to impact the way that the court rules on something. But Trump was doing his best to say, "I'm going to be president soon, so let me weigh in." Right? And they did, but they did say, and I know I'm teeing you up to give some that I know you wanted to talk about. Mitch McConnell did chime in as well.
Oh yeah, so yeah, we linked both briefs in the show notes because I thought they were particularly funny. Right, as you mentioned, Trump's is just laughable. He says, even though the act is going to be in place before I'm president, well, I'm going to be president, so that should matter, right? And it's like, no, we have one president at a time. And but he also mentioned that he has a lot of TikTok followers and he owns Truth Social. So he's an expert and he's really good at making deals. He literally argued this in his brief in front of the Supreme Court. And I'm just like, wow, I'm not one for reading legal briefs, but the intro on that definitely worth reading. Now, yes, Mitch McConnell, he was spitting fire. He starts off the brief by saying TikTok is a wildly popular social media application under the direct control of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm like, all right, you're coming off strong there. And, TikTok's only play to sort of stop litigation is to hope that Trump is going to, be more favorable to them. And so McConnell says this is a standard litigation play at the end of one administration with a petitioner hoping that the next administration will provide a stay of execution. This court should no more countenance it coming from foreign adversaries than it does from hardened criminals. Tell us how you really feel, Mitch.
Mitch is having fun in his no longer majority leader days.
And then he also threw some shade at the U.S. Court of Appeals. He says, for example, the venue provision of the Foreign Adversary Act in the D.C. Circuit, perhaps the most overstaffed and underworked court of appeals in the country, made the timely resolution of legal claims likely.
Yep.
Yeah, this is someone who just does not care anymore.
He's not feeling it. Yeah. And I think, when it's useful, I think, to look back or look ahead, right? And think, well, what's going to happen here? And I think TikTok is going to be banned if they don't sell it. I don't see any new legislation coming down the path, right? It's possible, I guess, Trump could get a majority in the House for something, maybe, but I don't see any way he'd even get a simple majority in the Senate, let alone enough to stop a filibuster, right? So TikTok is going to be banned, and it's interesting to see what's going to happen to this. And it sort of reinforces that it probably should be if China isn't willing to sell it, right? If they're not willing to divest of TikTok to let this keep happening, let this company keep making all kinds of money, something else is going on, right? And I think if you really want to understand sort of the Chinese approach to economics, take a look at how many of their successful entrepreneurs they end up putting in jail, right? When people get too big, it's not like, hey, this person is a great paragon of Chinese Communist Party virtue and we should celebrate them. It's like, gulag, right? They're more interested in their political control than they are in advancing their economic interests.
Right. Very, very true. So one thing I didn't hear in oral arguments, but then I found in the circuit argument was that when it comes to the First Amendment, divesting would actually bolster the First Amendment claims, right? Because China...
They meaning who?
TikTok's. So the circuit court said that TikTok's First Amendment rights would be bolstered if it was divested from ByteDance because
it'd be an American company.
Yeah, it'd be an American company free of content regulation from China. And once you're in America, the U.S. can't regulate your content.
Ask Mark Zuckerberg.
To go. Right. So I thought that was really funny. I'm actually surprised that it didn't come up into oral arguments. Most of the oral arguments stemmed from, the difficulty of decoupling the algorithm from ByteDance, and I get that, right? Because ByteDance is a company that has engineers throughout the world. They have people working in China. So coming up with like a new algorithm would be infeasible, right? But I think to your point about, we'll just sell it. That passes the least restrictive means test because that's worked for other companies before.
Sure,
There
it
is
works for
another,
all kinds of social media companies. For example, as we were saying before, Meta now owns WhatsApp.
right.
The WhatsApp people were more than happy to cash out and make a massive killing by selling WhatsApp to Meta.
Yeah,
And Instagram as well. Instagram was originally independent as well, as far as
yes,
I
they were.
recall. And nothing happened. When Meta bought these things, the world didn't stop, right?
Yeah.
For users, it was seamless, right? But the Chinese government, not interested.
Yeah. And I think we've banned Huawei devices, and they were 20% of the smartphone market in America, roughly speaking. And then there's a social media app called Grindr. It's basically mainly used for gay people to find other gay people, kind of like a gay Tinder, so to speak. And I think there was a Chinese individual who had like a 60% stake in the company, and he was forced to sell. And the court said that was A-OK. So, I just don't see how this law doesn't pass, Supreme Court muster. I will say, though, one thing I did notice was when the justices were talking about the covertness of the algorithm, and they didn't really seem too sympathetic to that argument that, like, oh, well, we don't know what's in it, therefore, it's okay to regulate it. It wouldn't surprise me if part of the law is struck down. I don't know how the severability aspect of it will occur. So what I mean by that is, can certain parts of the law survive without other parts, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's possible. But I think when it comes down to it, I think they're going to rule for the government that, you know what, China has to get rid of this, or it's not going to be allowed. And I mean, it's hard to argue that there's really any harm coming from this. It's not like we're telling anybody you can't say these things on social media. You can go on any social media platform you want and say the same thing.
Right.
We just don't want China to have a hand in this. And I think if you're doubting that the Chinese government is behind any of this, the fact that ByteDance won't sell, again, indicates there's something else going on here beyond money. Because as we just mentioned, Instagram was happy to sell, right? WhatsApp was happy to sell. Instagram was huge. It still is huge, right? There's a price for anything.
Right.
Somebody, if you're just into it for the business aspect, there's a price. And if someone meets your price, you'll sell. They're not interested in that. There's no price, not interested in selling. So there's other motives behind this other than simply doing business.
Yeah. So I think what it boils down to is, I don't think that there's going to be an injunction, right? January 19th is when the divestment needs to happen. And, maybe that will cause the Chinese government to say, hey, you know what, sell this, right? Because maybe they just thought everyone was bluffing. And now that there's like a hard date,
that's possible.
Maybe there'll be a price there, right?
Yep.
And then I do think that the Supreme Court is going to say, you know what? Yes, free speech is involved, and it falls under strict scrutiny. So the circuit court said, it passes both, but we're not going to decide which one it uses. I think the Supreme Court is going to say, this is strict scrutiny, and it passes, and done. TikTok is going to be sold or banned.
And I forgot my tinfoil hat today, but if I had it, I'd put it on and then tell us, you know what? Maybe Zuckerberg's getting ready to buy it. He's making nice with the Trump administration, so he can buy TikTok.
Yeah, I mean,
that would be my conspiracy theory prediction for the day. I don't think that's going to happen.
All right. I know that was a little heavy. Strict scrutiny, least restrictive means, national security. But, these are important. And I think that there are going to be huge ramifications to TikTok going dark. Whether we like it or not, we're kind of in this quasi-Cold War with China. And when you have a major case decided, that's going to, from like a legal perspective, dictate so many other cases when it comes to like this new era that we live in. So just keep that in mind. And when it comes to Facebook, we are always swinging back and forth when it comes to how we feel about things. Sometimes we overdo it, sometimes we don't do enough, and I think Facebook is just like a really good indicator that, hey, we're going in one direction now, and eventually we're going to hit a wall, and we're going to say that's too much or too little, and we're going to start going back and forth like that. It's just the way things are.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook is a very interesting case because, as we've said, that like they don't have any concern about what's said, right? They're just trying to skate through as easily as they can to make as much money as they can. We should maybe spare a moment for the fact-checking industry, because I've read about the fact-checking industry is really in trouble if Facebook is going to cutting their fact-checking. Bad news for the fact-checkers, right? Probably going to be layoffs and contraction in that industry. Not that should be our biggest concern, but certainly an impact that's going to be felt. But yeah, like as you said, right, both of these things, potentially important issues, right? What TikTok goes dark, certainly going to affect a lot of people. People have to figure out a new way to get their social media stuff. And if Facebook degenerates into kind of like what Twitter is, who knows what's going to happen there? It remains to be seen, as you said, how much this is really going to impact things. But it's certainly not going to make Facebook any better.
Yeah, whether or not we like it, the world is going to change. How we communicate is going to change, and we'll be here for the ride. We won't change. How about that?
There you go. I'm too old to change, and you're getting there.
All right, so I want to thank everyone for listening. Like, subscribe. Tell us how you feel about the cases. Again, we have the show notes. Read through it, and we'd be interested to hear your thoughts.